Big 12 Media Days there in Dallas. Let's start with some KU football talk, and then we'll get to some big picture realignment stuff at the end. For you listening to Lance Leipold, his introductory press conference, kind of listening to some of the players throughout, I guess what were just some of the things that caught your attention now going into year two? Obviously, KU didn't make it down to Dallas last year due to weather. So first time kind of listening to him in person, just kind of overall impressions of him and what you heard.
I think more than anything else, like you mentioned, obviously Lance Leipold wasn't able to make it last year, but it was obvious to me how comfortable he felt. It felt like this is a guy who's been in the job for a year, who understands some of the issues facing Kansas. He spoke very confidently, very thoroughly, and I felt like the whole team kind of had just like a very resolved feel to them. Obviously, Kansas over the past decade, it's been a rough go of it, but it really did feel like you started to feel some of Lance Leipold flowing through that program a little bit. You heard it in the way that I think players answered questions as well. And I think that whenever you're trying to do sort of this wholesale rebuild, right, the biggest thing is to try and fix that culture. And that's something that is a buzzword that, people like to say a lot. But I think that what it really means more than anything else is having somebody like Lance Leipold flowing through your program. You want to hear it. You want to hear similar answers whenever players are answering questions. You want to hear the coach kind of be on the same page with everybody else. And I think we really started to see some of that. I think that at this point, Lance Leipold certainly knows what he's up against, but I think that he has a better understanding of how to maybe address some of these issues on the football field than maybe some of the predecessors that I've heard before. I've been around for the Beatty years. I've been around for the Les Miles years. I've been going to Big 12 Media Days through all of that. And I do feel like this was one of the more professional media days that a Kansas coach has given over, the time that I've been covering the Big 12.
Yeah. Professional, I think, is the right word. I think you think about the way that Lance Leipold runs his program as well. And you mentioned culture. I think listening to some of the players, really interested to hear their perspective on how the culture has changed. And, I've experienced obviously covering Iowa State for a few years, and Campbell always talked about player-led leadership. And that has been the key word for Lance Leipold here early on, is kind of the player-led leadership. And I think you're starting to see some of that where Kenny Logan, the safety, told a story about how Craig Young, the Ohio State transfer, held a teammate accountable during practice. It wasn't a coach that had to do it. It was the player that did it. And I think you're right. Like the professionalism, everyone on the same page in terms of the culture, not really giving out win totals. I thought that was something that sometimes players and coaches alike can get caught into is, hey, we're going to win this many games. We're going to win this game, blah, blah, blah. Like for all of them, it was very much based on improvement. And I think improvement is what you saw kind of over the last few weeks of last season as well, right? The last 3 weeks, you beat Texas, you go and play TCU, West Virginia close. For you, I guess, is that when you look at the big picture for KU, is that the part of last season that has really stuck with you? Is it the overall improvement? I guess going back to last season and now heading into this off season, what were some of the things that kind of stuck with you that made you feel like, all right, Lance Leipold does have this thing going in the right direction?
No, I think that has to be such a big part of it, right? One thing that we talked about, and I'm sure that we'll get into, is in my mind, I kind of have this idea of progression when you're building a program, right? Your first year, you want to kind of figure out what's going on, what you want to be, what your players are able to be at whatever spot you're at. And then year two, you want to be competitive. And then year three, you want to win some of those competitive games. And for Kansas, I kind of throw in another year on the front, right? Because it is just very much figure out what the heck is going on. Obviously, just because of the hole that Kansas has been in. But we saw some aspects of what I would consider a traditional year one or even early year two at the end of the year one, right, for Kansas, which is not something that I think anybody really expected. Everybody's going to point to that Texas game, and for good reason, of course. But I really look at those other two games against West Virginia and against TCU and how competitive Kansas was in both of those two games. They looked like a team that belonged. They looked like a real FBS Power 5 level program for those 3 games to close out the year. And, and I don't want to lower the bar for them by any means, but I think that that's what you have to do, right? You have to be able to go in, you have to be able to make big plays. You have to be able to run things that make sense within your system. And I really like what they've been able to do from that perspective. Obviously you have to keep it up. The schedule doesn't get any easier this upcoming year, but I think that I still have that progression in my mind, right? Year one is a little bit of a throwaway, especially because of not having spring camp. Year two, I want to see a clear identity, even if it doesn't lead to wins. And hopefully by year three, there's some really competitive games, and Kansas can kind of be causing some issues in the Big 12.
Yeah, and I'm curious too from your perspective, returning production. That's something that Kansas has a lot of this year. I think they're number one in the Big 12, and Bill Connolly is returning production rankings. And for a program like KU, I think to maintain continuity is huge. There wasn't a ton of that. I think, some players stayed over between Les Miles and Lance Leipold, but you lost players like Marcus Harrison, Dejon Terry to SEC teams. Like, you lost players. And then this offseason, you look at the players that have left the program. It's a lot of guys that are going to group of 5 programs, FCS programs. There's some players that still haven't found a place where they're going to play college football. And I'm curious for you, like returning production, you look at not having spring before last season, and now it's your first time having a full blown, all right, we get back in January, we do some weightlifting, then we're going to go into spring ball in February, March, and April, and then everyone gets a break. We'll come back for summer. Like, how much do you feel like returning production has an impact for a team like Kansas, where I think back to last year, the team I covered, Iowa State, returned everybody and fell flat on their face? I guess, how do you weigh something like that with a program like Kansas that hasn't necessarily had that, but also had such a wide gap for so much of last season in terms of competitiveness?
Well, and I think that it's much more relevant for a program like Kansas who's trying to build their way up to bowl eligibility, for example, than it does to competing for the Big 12, for example, right? I think that at that level, it's really, yes, experience matters, but also talent matters. Also, different sort of things matter. When I'm looking at a situation like Kansas, I think the biggest thing is it gives you the ability to be additive, right? It gives you the ability to add value to what was already there instead of having to kind of shuffle the cards a little bit and having to redo it all over again. And obviously, we're going to get into it. Kansas brought in a great transfer class as well, a good recruiting class as well. And so I really like what they're bringing back, right? I think that historically, it's kind of been, there have been a couple of stars that Kansas has had, guys who are potential all Big 12 type guys, right? But then it's kind of a mess underneath it. I think that one of Kansas's biggest issues has been building up that quality depth to where, the first through fifth players are solid Big 12 players, but then you go like 20 through 30, that's where I think that Kansas has really struggled over the years. And so what I like about bringing back production and what I like about bringing back quality production more than anything else is I think that it does give Kansas an opportunity to build that 20 through 30, that 40 through 50, that 70 through 80, which I think is actually in a lot of ways where college football is decided. I don't think that, yes, Alabama has the 2 best players in the country right now, but they also have the best 20 through 25 in the entire country, right? I mean, that's what recruiting can do for you and what development does for you. So I think that what returning production means for Kansas more than anything else is it means that you have options where if something doesn't work out, if Jalen Daniels isn't the guy at quarterback, if, Kenny Logan doesn't have as good of a year as he had last year, you have guys who can step up and make up for some of those deficiencies. So you're not just wholly dependent on 1 or 2 players being absolute superstars.